Okay, now I know you read the title of this video and thought to yourself, bro, I've never even heard of Automaton Lung before. How can you make such a bold-faced statement? This game looks like hot ass. This looks like the aborted thought child of a Joel G cartoon. And you're going to claim that this game isn't getting the recognition it deserves?
Yeah, that's right. I can read your thoughts, you little cock-gobbling prick.
Listen, I'll admit that I'm rather biased towards this game. Objectively, I would score Automaton Lung a 7 out of 10 if I were being generous. I still think it's fun, but it's not without its flaws. However, from a creative standpoint, I do think this game is criminally underrated. And to explain where I'm coming from, we need to rewind back to when I was a kid in the 2000s. When I was growing up, the games industry wasn't as homogenous as it is today. Back then, people just had to throw shit at the wall and see what stuck. And it's how we ended up with such amazing titles from so many different developers. Obviously, we had bullshit artists like LJN, but for the most part, the studios behind these publishers had a drive to make games that they cared about, even if the games they made didn't always do well. It didn't matter if they were making simple games for kids or AAA blockbusters. You could tell that the people working on them were trying to make something that they thought was good. It was just a very different culture from the one we have today. There weren't a million different mechanisms that publishers could use to capture an audience and milk their wallets dry. You just had to make a good game and hope enough people bought it to get a return on investment. There had to be a dream and vision for your project, and that dream had to be something that you thought people would want to play. Given all that, you probably wouldn't think that this applies to a game like Automaton Lung. It has next to no story, the graphics look like something made for the PlayStation 1, and while the game has an interesting premise, the gameplay and level design is not without its flaws. But appearances can be deceptive. After all, what you're seeing on the screen wasn't even designed to run on a home computer. It was designed to run on this. Automaton Lung is nothing short of a technical marvel, the third entry in a series of projects made for the Unity engine, created by a single developer who simply wanted to publish games for his favorite handheld console. And with the modern day rise of indie game studios, I want to throw my hat in the ring and share why I love this game so much. This video's been a year in the making, and I'm so happy to finally get this one out the door. I'm fourentee, and this is Automaton Lung, the swan song of the Nintendo 3DS. Wait, hold on. Hello? It's pronounced Automadden, you idiot. Huh?
You fucked up the pronunciation.
What?
You've been playing Helldivers 2 for months now. How did you mess that up?
You gotta be
dementia-ridden dumbass.
The history of Automaton Lung is one filled with very little documentation. The game doesn't even have an entry on Wikipedia, and the storefront page on both Steam and the Nintendo eShop doesn't provide much information either. Hell, the eShop page technically doesn't even exist anymore, aside from a snapshot on the Wayback Machine. The only reason I even know about this game is because I discovered it 3 years back while watching a YouTube video that I couldn't even find again while writing this script. That's how obscure we're talking. To my knowledge, there's only 2 big interviews online which provide any insight behind the game's developer, Luke Vincent. The first is an IGN article by Rebecca Valentine, and the second interview is part of a YouTube video uploaded by Aqua Lounge TV. And after checking out these interviews, I was honestly taken aback by how earnest this guy was.
The 3D itself is a big part of it. I think the 3D is actually really cool and underrated. It can just be beautiful in certain games. I like how small and compact it is. I think it's one of the best forms for a portable console. Very comfortable, easy to play the game. You can pick it up and put it away right away. You could have stuff happen when you close that clamshell lid, or there's a gyroscope in there. It also helps if your game can be out in public for other people to see it in the real world.
For Luke, there was never really a monetary incentive behind these projects. The guy just really loved the original 3DS hardware, and it provided him with an interesting challenge as a Unity engine developer. For those who aren't aware, the original 3DS model only has 128 megabytes of RAM, which is the amount of memory that the CPU can use to quickly process information.
Pathetic.
However, Unity needed half of that just to even run on the system, which left Luke with only 64 megabytes to work with. I cannot begin to stress just how small that is. That's less than what was available on the Nintendo Wii. But Luke wasn't deterred. If anything, these constraints only helped to mold his vision.
As for the sparseness of the world, in 2020 when that pandemic hit, all those videos were out of, all the highways empty, all the cities completely empty, and so I thought it'd just be really cool if you could explore big empty cities. something that kind of expresses what that emptiness felt like during that time. I feel like in modern life, in this modern world, we're building an automated life support system. As much as I love technology, I think there's a reliance on it and a dependency that's kind of the Automaton Lung we're building to sustain our lives. And that's what I wanted to represent with that icy blue, like cyan color and all the indoor areas. And then there's that big warm orange sun.
The COVID-19 lockdowns, coupled with the base 3DS model's memory limit, played a major hand in shaping Luke's games on the 3DS. Automaton Lung is filled to the brim with these large, open spaces that have a ton of MacGuffins to collect. I personally wouldn't describe the levels as open world, at least not in the modern sense, but they're not exactly the sort of sandboxes you would see in games like Gary's Mod or Minecraft either.
Johnny Nash, do you trust me?
You wouldn't kill me, would you?
I wouldn't.
Oh,
never.
dude, showdown!
Oh, God!
It feels a lot more like the spacious maps from old Collectathon games, with the immediate example for me obviously being Mario 64. Personally, what I find interesting about Automaton Lung's development is that it closely mirrors the design ethos of games made for the Nintendo 64. While the N64 was a much more powerful console than the PlayStation 1, Nintendo's choice to continue using game cartridges ended up causing them a lot of problems during the N64's lifespan. The reason for this was because cartridges in the 90s stored far less data than what could be saved onto a CD, and as a result, Nintendo couldn't create games with tons of levels and music. It's because of this why franchises like Final Fantasy ended up migrating over to the PlayStation. So for developers who chose to stay and make games for the Nintendo 64, they had to get rather creative in terms of what games they could realistically make on the console. And even though I think the PlayStation outperformed the Nintendo 64, those constraints still resulted in a lot of incredible games and ports that helped set the N64 apart from the PlayStation. I think if there's anything that should be taken away from Luke's story, it's that tight constraints are capable of producing creative solutions. I don't think this should apply to every piece of art, but I do think that these sorts of limitations can force an artist to reevaluate their work. It creates an environment where artists can't easily rest on their laurels, and the end product is sometimes better off because of it. In Automaton Lung, you play as a silent, nameless woman dressed in black with a wrist-mounted arm blaster and a sick-ass hoverboard. Your character has escaped from some sort of containment chamber inside a massive tower, and immediately the player is given control of their avatar. Inside the tower, you'll find a plethora of different enemies to shoot, as well as these green chips that you can collect. There's 21 levels in the tower that you can tackle in any order, but you can also just leave the tower at any point. Upon going through one of the two exits, you'll eventually find this beetle-looking aircraft that you can pilot. From here, the world is your oyster as you're left to figure out how to complete the game. Automaton Lung's story is next to non-existent, and the onus is left on the player to determine what the fuck is going on. Personally, I feel that this design choice was rather deliberate, which stands in stark contrast to Luke's previous titles. While the Herald games contained characters and levels that lacked any sort of thematic cohesion, Automaton Lung by comparison has a very uniform aesthetic that serves to heighten the game's sense of mystery. The main character is drenched in Y2K fashion, and the enemies are highly inspired by early 3D graphics. Along with this, the abstract geometry coupled with the game's clash between natural and Art Deco environments is greatly evocative of Bryce 3D modeling programs, a staple of both 90s retrofuturism and the vaporwave aesthetic. Overall, the world is deliberately avant-garde, yet hints at a past civilization that we're observing the ruins of. It reminds me almost of games like Humaniki or Shadow of the Colossus, which also contain sparse environments that have little to no exposition. Now, before we go into the game's levels and mechanics in depth, I have a question I want to ask you. Would you agree that the controls in a video game define a player's ability to have fun? Even if you disagree with that, it's hard to ignore that the controls shape a player's ability to express and immerse themselves in the game they're playing. Take an FPS game like Halo, for example. If you were to play one of these games, you would expect the guns to behave a certain way, right? You would expect the AR to be mid as fuck, the shotgun and sniper to be pretty punchy, and for the BR to be rather overtuned. You would be expected to know how to make the most of grenades, and you would expect your movement to be rather slow compared to most other FPS games. Let's take another example. How about a horror game such as Amnesia or Silent Hill? Well, you'd expect your character to move like a tank, and the reason for this is because these games are designed to be tense. You would be expected to manage health items and other consumables, and in the case of something like Silent Hill, you would also be expected to conserve ammo on top of that. What about a trading card game like Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, if we're talking the modern game, you would expect the cards to have a paragraph worth of text printed on them, and for decks to play with themselves for 15 minutes straight if you don't open any hand traps. Look, the point I'm trying to get to is that if the controls of your game don't feel right, it may get in the way of a player's ability to have fun. So given all of that, how does Automaton Lung stack up?
The gameplay loop is equal parts collectathon and action platformer with a pinch of Sonic Riders thrown in for good measure.
On paper, this mishmash of genres produces a very unique gameplay formula that has a lot of potential for replay value. And for the most part, I would say that Luke succeeded in doing that. However, this game is pretty rough around the edges. Your character's actions can be split up into 3 categories: running and jumping with the aid of your jetpack, shooting enemies with your little Mega Man pea shooter, and riding your hoverboard across very large distances. There's also the aircraft that takes you between different levels, but I don't really have anything negative to say about it. It's pretty serviceable, and my only complaint is that I wish there were more locales to fly to and visit. Given what I've shown you so far, you would probably assume that Automaton Lung has a rather liberating control scheme that provides a whole host of mobility options. And this is true for the most part. The player's run speed is serviceable, and the turning is great for tight platforming. Your jump height is rather pitiful, but you're going to use the jetpack to get around anyways, so it hardly matters. These controls are hardly as fluid as titles like Pseudo Regalia or Sonic Adventure, but it's what I would expect from a standard 3D platformer. But once the hoverboard is thrown into the mix, that's when things start to get interesting. On the one hand, this Tony Hawk Pro Skater ass looking toy is pretty useful. I like how fast this thing can get, and I especially like how the hoverboard is used to enhance the game's platforming. Whenever you ride off the edge of a platform in Automaton Lung, your hoverboard will slowly descend as it maintains its current velocity and travels across the air. It's a very liberating feeling that I've seldom experienced in 3D platformers, and it reminds me a lot of the wing cap from Mario 64. It's a mechanic that isn't too difficult for beginners to grasp, but with enough practice, you can really abuse the hell out of it. But more importantly, this design choice promotes a lot of verticality in the game's level design, which I think is one of Automaton Lung's greater strengths. These levels are fucking huge, and I mean that in the best way possible. It feels great exploring every inch of these maps, and the hoverboard is what ties the whole experience together. The game just wouldn't be the same otherwise.
Now, I'm gonna do an F1 car. This is the one everybody thinks I'm good at.
However, there are a few issues I have with the hoverboard. First off, I wish this thing had a jump button. There's a few situations where the hoverboard can't always make it over geometry on the floor if it hasn't accrued enough speed, and having a jump button or something would actually alleviate that. That all being said, you'll rarely ever run into this issue once you get good at the game. Eventually, you'll just get a feel for when you're supposed to hop on your board, and when you reach those lips in the terrain, you'll always fly right over them. I personally tend to treat this issue more like a knowledge check. As a player, you should be expected to come to grips with the game's minute quirks and rough edges. This issue is ultimately a minor inconvenience, but as a critic, it had to be pointed out. I just think a jump button would have been nice. And considering Luke did add a jump button in the demo of his upcoming sequel, I figured that I'm not the only person who thought it was missing. Secondly, the steering is really stiff. You have to really get a feel for when you need to start turning or else you'll just run into shit constantly. I don't know if Luke was just worried about the controls being too slippery for the 3DS, but it still bothered me when I was playing. Like, I know that hoverboards are often obtuse in video games. Anyone that's ever played Shadow the Hedgehog can attest to that. But the steering in Automaton Lung is just uniquely bad. Typically in video games, a hoverboard is given poor handling in order to convey the device's anti-gravity properties, and this usually results in most hoverboards feeling slippery or floaty. It's for similar reasons why the Ghost in Halo drifts all over the place. But the hoverboard in Automaton Lung isn't like that. It's as stiff as the horse-drawn carriage in Assassin's Creed 2, which is saying a lot. It's a genuine challenge to get good at the hoverboard in this game. And while I like the hoverboard because of that, it does introduce a steep learning curve. That all being said, I do think the slow steering gives the hoverboard a lot of character. It's ultimately another quirk that you'll have to get used to on repeat playthroughs, and it does a good job at forcing the player to think critically when traversing the levels.
Finally, you can't easily shoot enemies while you're on the hoverboard, which feels like a missed opportunity. What's weird though is that you are able to lock onto enemies while you're riding it, but you can't steer the hoverboard while you're in lock-on mode. However, there is a benefit to this. When you're moving at top speed, you can use the lock-on to force the hoverboard into a sharp turn without sacrificing your current velocity. This can only be done when there's an enemy to lock onto, and it's clearly some sort of bug. But yeah, I just wish I could easily shoot while riding on this thing. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about the player's weapon real quick.
The shooting controls are what you would expect from a game like this. You can both shoot using the free aim camera along with an Ocarina of Time style lock-on button. Granted, you're never really going to use the free aim camera when fighting enemies. It's mostly designed for shooting environmental objects like breakable blocks. As far as combat goes, your go-to will be the lock-on camera. So, given that, it's a good thing that the lock-on controls are excellent. It feels pretty intuitive to control, and for the most part, I don't have any complaints here. The only thing I really have a problem with are the different weapon modes. There are 5 different modes in total that your pea shooter can use, and 4 of them have to be unlocked by exploring the world. They aren't exactly what I would call balanced. Hell, the final weapon that you get for collecting all the chips can literally one-shot bosses, but they're still pretty fun to use. My complaint is that I wish the different weapon modes had more utility. Once I got my hands on the machine gun, I basically just used that for the rest of the game. There was very little reason for me to even switch weapons. The machine gun had incredible DPS and could easily track enemies with the lock-on feature. Like, I know that combat isn't the biggest priority in Automaton Lung, but it would have been nice if the guns were all fun to use. Like, imagine if one of the weapon modes allowed you to rocket jump or something. Now all of a sudden, I would have a reason to actually switch away from the machine gun because I could use it to further enhance my platforming capabilities. Overall, these controls are enjoyable and they work well in tandem with one another. Despite some of the issues with the gameplay mechanics, I still managed to have a lot of fun and was able to ignore its shortcomings. But the controls are only half the story. We'll move on to the non-player elements next, and we'll start with the game's level design. The majority of levels in Automaton Lung are split into 2 categories, the larger open zones and these small puzzle box levels. The smaller levels are mostly found within an elevator at the starting zone of the game, whereas the larger areas have to be reached through the use of the aircraft. The small levels are all bite-sized maps that take about 2 to 5 minutes to complete on repeat playthroughs, and they're all pretty distinct from one another. They also have a pretty wide variety of enemies to deal with, and this helps to keep each level from feeling repetitive. Now, as for the larger zones, they're also pretty unique and fun to explore. You've got pyramids that contain giant heads, hidden desert bases buried underneath massive ruins, a city inside of a birdcage, and even an elevator that brings you down into a dark, frozen abyss. You know, standard video game affair. You can kind of divide these levels up into 2 subcategories as well. First are the massive areas that contain a lot of chips. The player is tasked with exploring every inch of these levels, along with any interior areas, and they'll often have switches that unlock parts of the level which were previously blocked off. Overall, they're the highlight of the game, and I always have a blast collecting all the chips in these areas. They remind me the most of open spaces from games like Banjo and Kazooie, and I really wish there were more of these levels in the game. The second type are levels that house all the different weapon modes. Usually these areas have a lot of space that contain a single puzzle that you have to solve, and once you complete it, you're given access to a new mode for your arm blaster. Compared to the larger open zones, these levels are rather disappointing. The problem I have with the weapon levels is that the puzzles aren't very fun on repeat playthroughs. Once you know the solution, they take maybe a minute or 2 to solve, and beyond that, there isn't anything else to really do in these levels. So how would you go about fixing that? Perhaps it would be wise to take a page out of the temples from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. What if the player had to traverse through a temple with their current arsenal, and then halfway through the level they would unlock a new weapon mode? Then for the rest of the level, the player would have to utilize that unlockable in order to make their way back to the entrance. This also plays into the idea of giving the weapon modes more utility since the assets made for the temples could be reused across the rest of the game. And while we're on the topic of utilizing things across the game, this would be a good time to further dissect the tower elevator. Simply put, I don't understand why all the smaller levels are localized to the starting zone of the game. This is a criticism that I heard initially in Solo Wing Theory's review of Automaton Lung, and while I was able to brush it off originally, it's slowly become impossible for me to ignore.
You need, at minimum, 120 of those picture frames in order to open that gate, which is your main goal, of course. So going back to the start, all the way at the beginning, you start at the very tippy top of a tower. This tower is a tutorial. It's the thing you handle before anything else in the game, and I think we can all agree starting a game off with a tutorial so that the player knows what they're doing, or at least putting them in environments so that they can mess around and figure out what their options are, is sensible. What's a little bit less sensible, however, is the fact that this tower has something like 22 levels, not including the city at the top and the desert at the bottom, which is a separate level, and each one of these levels has 5 picture frames. Doing the quick math here, there's something like 110 picture frames in this tutorial, of 210. Now, I'm no mathologist, so much so that I like to use the term mathologist instead of mathematician, but that's half the collectibles in the game just relegated to the tutorial. Bearing in mind that this is a game about exploring this world and seeing what's out there and interacting with it and coming to your own conclusions and building the story backwards from that, why is the majority of the collectibles that you need to complete the game in the tutorial exactly? I just don't understand that.
The thing you need to understand about collectathon games is that it's very easy to introduce pacing issues if you don't know what the hell you're doing. Donkey Kong 64, for example, kind of has the exact opposite problem. That game has a million different roadblocks that can stifle the player's ability to have fun, and having to constantly swap between characters can get rather annoying. But in the case of Automaton Lung, stuffing these many chips into the starting zone can make the game a lot shorter than originally intended. And I'm sorry, but for as much as I love this game,
The fuck were they thinking?
now for what it's worth, you can just ignore the tower elevator and tackle it last. That's what I did on my first playthrough because I like to get lost and fuck around in the games I'm playing. I'm an Elder Scrolls fan, it's what I do. But most gamers aren't like that. They're just going to clear all the levels in the elevator once they discover it's there. And then when they find the final boss area, they'll just make a beeline for the end of the game. And that's a huge problem if you're wanting your player to go and visit every level. This single issue is why this game scored so low at the beginning of the video. Because despite how much this game has going for it, none of that really matters if you can just finish the game in like 2 to 3 hours tops. But the part that really irks me is that this problem is very easy to solve. All Luke had to do to solve this issue is take the 20 or so levels from the tower and disperse them between the bridge area, the cathedral area, the large city area, and the desert area. This would have allowed the player to still tackle the chips in whatever order they want, but they would have had to go and explore the other larger areas of the game in order to face the final boss. This major issue aside though, I do still like the levels this game has to offer. Each of the smaller puzzle levels are incredibly fun to engage with the exception of like 2 levels. And they all have a unique layout and atmosphere that makes finding their chips a joy to collect. And as for the larger zones, I had a lot of fun exploring every nook and cranny. I do think this game would have benefited a lot if it had additional secrets that weren't tied to progression, but what's here is fine. I also really like how you have to visit the endgame area in order to track your progress. It's a cool way to show this sort of thing diegetically, and it helps emphasize the importance of this area within the game's story. So that about sums up my thoughts regarding the levels. But a level is only as good as its contents. Aside from the puzzles and collectibles, how are the enemies in this game? Well, you can divide the enemies into 2 categories, fodder and bosses. The fodder enemies all have a wide range of designs and mechanics. You've got stuff like the cubes, which serve as your basic enemies. There's quite a few different hoppy guys that'll pursue the player and try to ram themselves into them. You've got these flying head busts which zone around the player and attempt to shoot at them. There's these bug-looking guys which can phase through walls. I can go on, but they're all pretty bizarre. Now, the fodder enemies aren't exactly hard, and the reason for this is because combat isn't exactly a major focus in Automaton Lung. These guys basically just exist as obstacles to either kill and avoid, and for the most part, you can kind of just ignore them. I do wish that some of these enemies were a little more difficult, but collectathon games aren't exactly known for having difficult enemies. The bosses, however, are rather disappointing. The main problem I have is that there isn't exactly a strategy to beating them. You just have to deal enough damage to them until they die. While I think the arenas you fight them in are somewhat interesting, it always feels like I'm on autopilot during these fights. They just feel sort of lazy if I'm being honest. In order for a boss to feel unique, they have to have their own mechanics that sets their battle apart from the normal enemies in the game. A well-designed boss is often a test of the player's skills, and they often have a rather unique moveset that gives them a distinct identity and flavor. But more importantly, a good boss forces the player to think critically, or at least more critically than when they're facing normal enemies. And that's not really how these bosses are designed. To show you what I'm talking about, we'll use the sock monkey boss from the tower levels as an example. Yeah, this game has some weird fucking designs. The main issue with the boss in particular is that it doesn't really do anything but float around and occasionally shoot a single fireball at the player. Like, I get this thing is meant to be a sort of tutorial boss, but considering it's the only other boss in Automaton Lung aside from the other 2 at the very end of the game, I really wish that it put up more of a fight. What I probably would have done to improve this is give the monkey a variety of attacks along with a few other movement options. For example, what if it had an attack where it flew around the arena and started spamming fireballs towards the center of the battlefield? Doing this would force the player to utilize their jetpack in order to dodge the incoming attack, which ensures that your jumping skills are being tested. The monkey could have also had a fireball barrage attack where it tries to shoot repeated balls where the player is currently standing.
This would have forced the player to reposition and run away from the incoming stream until it stops, which again would test the player's ability to run and avoid attacks. What about a move where the monkey creates a large AoE blast around itself that quickly expands outwards, engulfing a quarter of the arena? You see what I'm getting at, right? This is the sort of stuff you have to think about when designing a boss fight. That all being said, I'm willing to give the boss fights a pass considering that the game was made for the 3DS. Given both the RAM limitations and the control scheme, there could have been a genuine concern about the bosses being too frustrating, either because of performance drops or the 3DS button layout. Overall though, the fodder enemies are enjoyable and the bosses are
the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever.
They're certainly not the highlight of the game, but they do add a bit of flavor while you're hunting for chips. This is probably going to be the shortest section of this video, considering just how vague and abstract this game is. Automaton Lung's story, if there even is one, is very open to interpretation. Simply put, the game doesn't really provide enough information to establish an objective narrative to begin with. This is supported by Luke's own perspective towards his game, which is equally vague. While I believe that there isn't much of a story to grasp onto in Automaton Lung, I do think that there are underlying themes. And during my time playing this game, the ones I were able to identify were the themes of both time and mortality. The entire reason Luke started publishing games for the 3DS was because it was his favorite console to make games for, and Automaton Lung was slated to be one of the last games to release on the 3DS eShop. Obviously this is speculation on my part, but I had to imagine there was some sort of anxiety behind that as he worked frivolously to publish this game before the eShop's closure. My reason for believing this is because of the game's level design. Unlike what I've seen from the Herald games, Automaton Lung's levels are far more melancholic. You have all these empty streets and structures that are devoid of human life, and the main goal of the game is basically to destroy what's left of this world. Much like the console was designed for, it's almost like the planet is on life support, waiting to finally be laid to rest. And as the player, we're tasked with the goal to carry out this world's final request. The enemies we face hardly even put up a fight either, almost like they've been fighting a losing battle for quite a while now. This would actually explain the minimalist designs of the enemies. Perhaps they're being eroded away by this dying world. Though I think the biggest piece of evidence can be found inside the pyramid. Perhaps the world itself is alive, barely clinging on to its own existence. Once you've collected at least 120 chips, the door blocking off the final boss will disappear. From here, the player will descend down a hole in the floor and face off against a giant golem.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that?
After the player defeats the golem, it blows up into a million pieces and the facility begins to self-destruct. Akin to games like Super Metroid, the player is tasked with escaping the crumbling facility. But once they leave, they find that the world they once knew has given way to a dark, neon-soaked abyss. With the aid of their hoverboard, the player must traverse through the empty void and reach the final boss. Once the player has eliminated it, what remains of this world completely fades away before our player becomes engulfed in flames. And after all this buildup, all of this rising tension, we're kicked back to the title screen. The game is over, and we're only left with the option to start a new file or continue our last save. When I said Automaton Lung forces the player to make of it what they will, that wasn't an exaggeration. This game is abstract to a fault. Personally, I really like that about Automaton Lung, but I wouldn't be doing my job as a critic if I ignored this. If you're used to more conventional games that have at least some semblance of a story, Automaton Lung will probably piss you off. But this really wasn't a problem for me. I've already played a lot of esoteric games before, chief among them being Pathologic, so I was already acclimated to this sort of experience and was able to just enjoy the game for what it was. Overall, Automaton Lung is my favorite game on the 3DS. It's not anything mind-blowing when you sit down and look at it critically, but the level of dedication that went into making this game work on the original 3DS hardware is honestly impressive. It has its shortcomings for sure. Super Kiwi 64 does this sort of gameplay loop a lot better, to be honest. But it's still a fun romp, and the game's atmosphere feels pretty Spartan in a good way. It's the closest thing I've experienced to a Yume Nikki clone on the 3DS, and overall it reminds me a lot of my favorite childhood games while also carrying its own identity. Sadly, the Nintendo eShop is no longer officially supported, but if you still want to go check out this game, you can pick up the HD version on Steam. I hope you guys consider giving it a shot. I wouldn't have talked about this game for over 20 minutes had I not enjoyed it.
If you guys enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. This is going to be the first in a series of indie game videos, and I'm really excited to share what all I've been playing recently. Thanks, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!